Toronto Metropolitan University, where I teach child and youth care practice. I'm also the director of the grad program, so I'm working constantly with graduate students as they move through the master's program. Before that, before I came to the university to teach, I was what's called in Canada the child advocate, and I was the child advocate for Ontario for a very, very long time. And my job in that role was to really ensure that kids, particularly kids who are vulnerable, are safe and protected, and they were receiving the resources that they required. And so that was kids in the child welfare system or shelters, kids in mental health facilities or with mental health issues, kids that had special needs or developmental disabilities, but most importantly, kids who were in the young offender system. So I've worked maybe 30 years with young people looking at issues related to mental health, and also looking at youth in the justice system who have survived that kind of institutional setting. So I'm here to talk about trauma and the trauma that these young people have experienced, and from my perspective anyway. So there's different kinds of trauma that you can think about when you think of young people. The major one, though, and I would say that 80% of all young people who find themselves incarcerated or in the youth justice system come from a family environment where there's been violence. And either the young people have witnessed violence or they have experienced violence themselves. And that could be physical abuse, that could be emotional abuse, that could be child sexual abuse. It's every nature and type of violence kids will endure actually as they're growing up. Another form of violence, which is really prevalent now, is bullying, and that's aggression against young people by other young people. We call that peer violence, and in institutions, you see a lot of peer violence, which really puts young people at risk, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Gang violence, street violence, racism is violent as well. And then institutionally imposed violence, which is what we find in young offender settings. But one that we're now talking about, which is a relatively new one for us to be talking about, is mass violence. And mass violence would be like you experienced in Iran with the uprising. And that's where many, many, many people were traumatized by an incident, multiple incidents, fear. So those, from my perspective, are the major forms of violence that young people would be facing. And what happens when kids come from any environment of violence? Usually it starts in the family. And that's where young people learn about violence, and they reenact the patterns that they see between their parents or between siblings and parents, or parents and extended family. So they learn those kinds of aggressive or violent interactions. And that's what they've learned. That's how they live their life. That's how they understand life. And so they take that kind of form of interaction, if you want to call it that pattern of interaction, into the school, into the community, onto the streets. And it's reinforced and perpetuated as it moves, as kids move on in their life. If there isn't some kind of intervention or some kind of intersection with these young people. Because what happens is they continue the cycle of violence and become more embedded in the cycle of violence and grow up understanding and knowing that cycle of violence and reestablishing it in their relationships. When we talk about, okay, so what happens with young people when they've experienced some form of trauma, some form of aggression or violence directed at them, or they witness it? What happens is the impact of this is that young people then don't trust people, particularly adults, and they lose their sense of curiosity because they become afraid to explore outside of their inner self or the smaller world, out of fear of being re-abused, quite frankly. And it reaches a point where they don't trust themselves. They don't trust their own senses and that they have the ability to know and understand reality, because reality is very much distorted for them. So the world to them is a dangerous place. And it's a place where you have no control. Violence is unpredictable and it can be directed at you. There's two ways that we see young people expressing their feelings around their experience, their childhood experience, and they can externalize those thoughts and feelings, which is, like I've been saying, it turns into aggression and violence directed outwards. And we see that with as you know, with very young kids, but we particularly see that with young people in their adolescence. Or they internalize the violence, and their thoughts and feelings about violence are internalized. It used to be that it was mostly girls who would internalize these feelings and these thoughts. It's not that way anymore. Girls, as much as boys, will act out externally or within themselves. And we're seeing more and more young people, boys, sort of 12, 13 to 18, who have become quite introverted and holding on to these really traumatic feelings. And this is particularly important because of COVID, because they didn't have the outlets for socialization. They didn't have the outlets to leave home to go to school, or leave home and go to recreational activities, leave home and go to church. So they were in an oppressive environment, and where they couldn't act out, so they would internalize. So we see very much young people who are quite depressed, quite anxious, who have feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, and often turn to addictions, multiple kinds of addictions, although more drug-related now, not so much alcohol-related. And so we're seeing a rising number, a rising percentage of young people who are depressed, anxious, and suicidal. So in all settings, we're seeing these young people, but particularly in youth justice settings, we have to be vigilant around young people being depressed and suicidal. And we see in Canada anyway, we see young people suiciding in our jails and in our institutions. So that's sort of painting a picture of violence, trauma, I'll call it trauma, and young people.